If there's two things audiences are tired of, it's reboots and superhero movies. And if there's two things audiences won't stop watching, it's reboots and superhero movies. Just looking at the top 10 highest grossing films of 2025 is a pretty good representation of where cinema is at right now. 8 of the 10 are sequels, reboots, or remakes. It seems like these movies are announced, everyone collectively groans and says who asked for this, and it still breaks $1 billion. How did we get here? Well, a lot of factors are to blame, but one that seems to be falling under the radar as time goes on is Batman Begins. This is the movie that put the term reboot into the public consciousness. And for many that hold prejudice towards the superhero genre, this film and its sequels are the exception. As time goes on, the direct influence Batman Begins had on the film industry is dwindling, but make no mistake, it is one of the most significant releases of the 21st century. Today we'll be taking a look into Batman Begins and the effect it had on superhero films, reboots, and the film industry as a whole. Also in the coming months, I'll be taking a look at each film in Christopher Nolan's stellar filmography. If that seems interesting to you, feel free to subscribe. Now without further ado, let's see how Batman Begins changed everything.
Did you have a dream? Nightmare?
The character of Batman is almost 90 years old at this point. Because of that, many fans have vastly different ideas on what Batman should be. Personally, I grew up in a post-Batman Begins world, so to me, his stories were consistently dark and gritty. The character had a tragic origin story, and was far more serious than other heroes like Spider-Man or Superman. For anyone who was growing up before Batman Begins, however, he would be entirely different, on the big screen at least. In 1989, Tim Burton's Batman was released. It was actually pretty dark in tone and did well both critically and commercially. The sequel, Batman Returns, didn't do quite as well, however. This was largely due to controversy surrounding the film's subject matter. Many parents viewed it as too violent and strangely sexual. And honestly, they're right, Batman Returns is weird. I feel like a lot of movies fall into this trap of trying to appeal to both children and adults, and instead of succeeding at it, like Shrek for example, it instead feels like the writers couldn't decide who they were making it for. Because of this controversy, Tim Burton was fired and replaced with Joel Schumacher. Schumacher made Batman Forever, a campier, more lighthearted take on the Caped Crusader. And despite not doing extremely well critically, it was a financial success, so Schumacher was given another crack at it. This is what led to the now infamous Batman and Robin. Both critically and financially, it was a disaster. It made only slightly less than Returns, but it cost over double the amount to make. This almost completely killed Batman's presence on the big screen, and unfortunately, Schumacher's next project was looking to be the biggest, most expensive yet. It was initially titled Batman Unchained and was set to bring back each villain from the previous 4 movies. Naturally, Warner Bros. Canceled the project after the complete failure of Batman and Robin. Between 1997 and 2003, many ideas were pitched to Warner Bros. For a Batman sequel. Eventually, Nolan heard from his wife, Emma Thomas, about Warner's interest in the new Batman project. She mentioned it in passing to him because she figured he wouldn't be interested in doing it. This may sound crazy now, but at the time it made sense. It just goes to show how badly Batman and Robin ruined the character's reputation. Nolan claimed that he had a vision for a Batman movie though. He felt like there was a story that hadn't been told yet. After a brief 15-minute meeting with Warner Bros., Nolan was hired to direct the next Batman movie. And this was a crazy decision from Warner Bros. Nolan's highest grossing project at the time was Insomnia, which only made $113 million. Now for Warner to give him the keys to the Batman franchise and a $150 million budget seemed insane. It was a ridiculous gamble, but whatever was said in that meeting clearly had them convinced, and the rest was history. Not being much of a comic book fan himself, Nolan enlisted the help of David Goyer to write the story. Nolan did have a vision, however. This project had to be an origin story, exploring the time between the death of Bruce's parents and his becoming Batman. He wanted it to be dark, in order for Batman to become respectable in the public eye once again. To do this, he went to great lengths to establish a sense of realism. The city of Gotham is recontextualized. Batman's suit, grapple gun, batarangs, and even the Batmobile were given reasonable explanations as to why they exist and look the way they do. Despite this, the narrative still exists within a heightened reality, or as Nolan calls it, cinematic reality. Even though there is a noir aesthetic and morally complex narrative, Batman Begins doesn't skip out on the massive action sequences and set pieces that make comic book films what they are. One complaint Batman Begins gets a lot nowadays is that there's too much exposition, and I would be inclined to agree, but when considering the context in which it was made, the writing is understandable. Making Batman respectable was the number one goal in this production. Batman had to be reinvented after the travesty of Batman and Robin. The direction Nolan and Goyer chose was to ground Batman in reality. So long as that's the direction the narrative was going in, they had to commit to it, and they absolutely did. There's no larger-than-life elements in this story that don't have at least an attempted explanation. As with any comic book adaptation, however, the casting process was complex. Unlike most other comic book adaptations, though, this cast is near perfect. Christian Bale plays a convincing Batman and a flawless Bruce Wayne, which we'll discuss more later. Michael Caine is genuinely the perfect Alfred, and while we've had decent Alfreds since, none will top Caine's performance in this trilogy. It also helps that Alfred is given plenty to do in this story, as well as some of the best lines in the trilogy. In a similar vein is Lucius Fox, played by Morgan Freeman. He's one of the most likable characters in the trilogy, and Morgan Freeman does an excellent job in the role. Gary Oldman's performance as Jim Gordon is far too underrated throughout this trilogy in my eyes. He actually ended up being one of my favorite characters. Liam Neeson does a great job as well, but that's to be expected. Finally, in a movie full of great performances, Cillian Murphy's performance as Scarecrow still stands out amongst the rest. It's actually flawless. It's rightly disturbing while still delivering on the theatricality that the character should display. With the right cast, crew, and a studio that had unwavering confidence in Nolan's vision, it was only natural that Batman Begins would turn out the way it did. It released in June of 2005, and although not an instant hit financially, it was immediately recognized for its groundbreaking nature. Through positive word of mouth, the film eventually ended up becoming a financial success as well, although not nearly as much as the later entries in this franchise would be. That's a story for another day though. For now, what exactly was it about Batman Begins that captivated audiences and shifted the landscape of cinema as we know it?
As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored, I can be destroyed, but as a symbol, I can be incorruptible.
Batman Begins, as the title suggests, is an origin story. And in the same manner in which Richard Donner's Superman made the character's origin a part of pop culture, Batman Begins did that for Batman. Although not pulled directly from the comics, it works really well for the story Nolan and Goyer are trying to tell here. And speaking of that story, I have to point out how technically sound it is. The opening acts build beautifully into the intense final act. Each plot point is foreshadowed, and this is so essential in a film like this. For the first hour and 40 minutes, we have a fairly grounded story, so when things start getting a bit less realistic in the final act, it needs to be believable. Since we've already been familiarized with concepts like hallucinogenic gas and microwave emitters, we aren't caught off guard when these serve as the premise of the climax. Another thing that makes this story more believable is Nolan's use of practical effects. If something could be done practically, it was. The behind the scenes for this film is truly jaw-dropping. They even went as far as to use real bats in certain scenes. Obviously, for moments with a ton of bats, like the iconic scene with Bruce in the Batcave, CGI was used, but it's still a beautiful scene. In fact, this whole movie is gorgeous. The establishing shots are great at displaying the atmosphere of Gotham, to the point that it feels like a unique city, despite being heavily inspired by Chicago. One complaint I do have regarding the visuals, though, is the fight scenes. I've seen people call out the choreography or the cinematography, but more than either of those, I think the editing is the problem. The cuts are simply way too fast. It's consistently disorienting. Now, the choreography might be bad, and admittedly the camera placement and framing could have been better, but honestly I can't even tell because of how fast these cuts are. So maybe this was done intentionally to mask those issues. Back to the story though, since it is so focused on the titular character, it wouldn't have mattered how well written it was if the protagonist wasn't interesting. Both Nolan and Christian Bale have said that Batman is often overshadowed by his villains, and while I don't 100% agree, I do think that Batman has the most compelling rogues gallery in comics. With this story, Nolan intended to keep the focus on Bruce Wayne as much as possible. That's why Christian Bale's casting was so important. Nolan put it well when he said that Bale had the necessary balance of darkness and light. The Dark Knight trilogy is the only piece of Batman media to ever get me truly invested in the character of Bruce Wayne, and Bale's performance is a big part of that. He's able to switch on a dime from Batman to the billionaire playboy Bruce Wayne to the real Bruce Wayne, who shows weakness and even fear at times. Speaking of fear, that really is the central theme of this story. It serves as a benchmark with which we can follow our hero's progress. For example, at the beginning, Bruce cowers in fear of the bats, and this fear indirectly leads to his parents' death. Because of this, he links these two traumas together. His fear of bats and his guilt over the loss of his parents intertwine into one massive fear that he must conquer in this narrative. Goyer and Nolan have actually said they came up with a lot of the plot elements before deciding on the antagonists. This was done so that the story wasn't dictated by the antagonist, but instead that they would serve the narrative. Clearly that idea went out the window for The Dark Knight, and that absolutely works in that movie. But for Batman Begins, I think changing the villains to fit Bruce's character arc was the right call. As I mentioned, this story is about fear, and who could be a better choice than Scarecrow? a villain that sprays out a hallucinogen that makes you confront your worst fears. Ra's al Ghul is also a great choice, considering the spin they put on his character here. Also, I'm going to pronounce it Raz because that's how they say it in this movie. I know it's incorrect, but I also don't really care. A large part of Bruce's fears stem from his guilt over the death of his parents. By establishing Raz as a father figure for Bruce, it forces him to confront this fear head on. This connection is made especially obvious in the final act when Raz tells Batman not to be afraid, echoing Thomas Wayne's final words to his son. Bruce also has a fear of not making his father proud. It's actually Rachel telling him that his father would be ashamed that leads to the eventual creation of Batman. A moment I love actually comes just after this scene. When Bruce decides to go into exile, he gives his coat to a homeless man. Once he finally returns, 7 years later, during his first mission as Batman, he sees that same homeless man wearing his coat. Most people treat the scene as a joke because of the nice coat moment, but it's actually very important to the narrative. It bookends Bruce's transformation into Batman and signals to the audience that he really has become the symbol he hoped to be, incorruptible and capable of causing real change. As Carmine Falcone stated earlier in the film, Bruce will always fear what he doesn't understand. In Bruce's travels, he began to understand the criminal mind and no longer has any reason to fear. And then, as was mentioned, throughout the rest of the story, he gets over his fear of bats, his parents' death, and the fear of letting his father down. I'm also just now realizing how easily this story could have translated to Daredevil. His whole concept being the man without fear, and then having his origin story depict him getting over each one of his fears, that would have been great, but instead we got this. Well, at least Batman fans also got screwed over by a bad adaptation of their favorite superhero played by Ben Affleck. Before moving on, there is one more plotline that satisfyingly comes full circle in the final scene. Early on in the narrative, Bruce states that he'd tear down Wayne Manor brick by brick. After Wayne Manor is literally torn down, however, he has to be comforted by Alfred, and in the final moments of the film, he pledges to rebuild it exactly the way it was, aside from some additions to the Batcave. This is perfect because it shows how Bruce has grown throughout the story and builds anticipation for a sequel. In the documentary on the making of the Dark Knight Trilogy, it was stated that more so than making a Batman movie, they were making a Christopher Nolan movie. And that is evident, especially as the trilogy went on. The first act of Batman Begins actually has the non-linear storytelling for which Nolan is known for, and at times this narrative feels more like a noir than a typical superhero story. Despite that, we still get a massive, exciting set piece for the final act and plenty of explosions. This is what happens when a serious filmmaker is given the reins to a franchise they respect. And nowadays, DC is trying to recreate the same magic with Snyder's initial DC Expanded Universe, and now with Gunn's DC Universe. That's obviously not where the influence ends with Batman Begins and its sequels, however. Of course, it propelled superheroes even further into the mainstream, opening the door for things like the MCU, but it also popularized the gritty reboot. Over the next 2 decades, we would see numerous franchises get gritty reboots. The general consensus seems to be that this is toxic for the industry, and I can definitely see that, but I don't think it's inherently a bad thing. Sometimes a reboot can work great, as was the case with Batman, but it mostly comes down to getting the right people involved with the project. Like I mentioned at the outset, Batman Begins had a perfect cast, crew, and the minds behind it were given the freedom needed to tell the story they wanted to. Unfortunately, most studios simply looked at Batman Begins' success through a broad lens and tried forcing those same ideas into their franchises, not realizing that the things that made the Dark Knight trilogy so great had been a thing in the comics for a while and were intrinsic to the character of Batman. Some that immediately come to mind are the Fantastic Four, Transformers, Ninja Turtles, and of course Superman. Unfortunately, in some cases, that dark and gritty phase did damage the aforementioned franchises. However, things finally seem to be turning around. This year, we of course had the Superman and Fantastic Four reboots, both of which I loved. But we also got Transformers 1 and TMNT Mutant Mayhem in the past couple years, which both took those franchises back to their roots in many ways. Despite the damage Batman Begins did to the film industry for a bit there, I still love the movie. It's not Nolan's fault studios watched his films and took all the wrong lessons away from it. Along with a lot of the early MCU movies, I have Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy to thank for my obsession with both superheroes and film as a whole. As a kid, Batman was never one of my favorite superheroes. I liked Spider-Man and Iron Man, and if I was watching something DC related, it was most likely the Justice League cartoon, where my favorites were Superman and Flash. Batman was cool, but he didn't have any powers, and I liked the funnier superheroes more. Honestly, the Nolan Batman films only came onto my radar because my sister recommended them when I was around 12. She didn't even like Batman, but she loved these movies, so clearly there had to be something to them. I watched them and instantly knew they were special. When I was a kid, I had this habit of watching a film multiple times in a row if I liked it. Still something I do now, but much less intense than it was back then. I wouldn't watch anything else until I had gotten everything I could out of the movie I was watching. And that's exactly what happened with the Dark Knight trilogy. I watched Batman Begins several times before moving on to The Dark Knight, and then I watched The Dark Knight countless more times before moving on to Rises. Needless to say that I'm excited to finally discuss The Dark Knight. The Empire Strikes Back, Aliens, Paddington 2. These are some of the most legendary sequels ever made. Sequels always have been and always will be a staple of the entertainment industry. Despite how common they are though, a sequel is still a pretty scary thing to attempt. You have to stay true to the essence of the original, while expanding on the concepts presented in an interesting way. On top of that, audiences are going to expect much more than what they got in the original. They want a grander scale, bigger set pieces, and any and all problems present within the first installment to be fixed. Christopher Nolan had to contend with these issues when making The Dark Knight. After successfully reinventing Batman on the big screen with Batman Begins, he now needed to give audiences more. The allure of Batman Begins was its grounded nature though. If he went too far, he could alienate fans of this new Batman. On the other hand, if he played it too safe, dark and gritty Batman could become a tired concept on only his second outing. So how do you properly up the scale from the grounded noir origin story depicted in Batman Begins? Well, you start by changing the genre. The Dark Knight, more than being a superhero movie, is an epic crime drama on a grand scale. Yet somehow it still follows the established rules and conventions of this universe. This perfect balance led to The Dark Knight garnering one of the most illustrious reputations in film history. It's often lauded as the greatest superhero movie ever made, one of the greatest sequels ever made, and one of the greatest films of all time. It ranks third on the IMDb Top 250 list. It has a 94% in Rotten Tomatoes, and a staggering 4.5 stars on Letterboxd. How did The Dark Knight gain such a reputation, and what effect did it have on the film industry and Nolan's career? Today we'll be finding the answers to those questions, and in the coming months, I'll be diving into each film in Christopher Nolan's stellar filmography. If that sounds interesting to you, feel free to subscribe. Now, without further ado, let's take a look at Christopher Nolan's magnum opus, The Dark Knight. In the final scene of Batman Begins, a Joker card is shown, teasing the character. This seems to imply that a sequel was planned from the beginning, but this actually wasn't the case. Before Batman Begins' release, both Warner Bros. And Nolan were unsure just how profitable this franchise could be. Following the financial and especially the critical success of Batman Begins, however, Warner Bros. Prioritized a sequel. After Nolan completed production on The Prestige, he got to work on The Dark Knight. Though he and writer David Goyer had considered some ideas for a sequel while making Batman Begins, nothing had actually been decided. In the end, the final scene in Batman Begins did serve as the basis for many concepts present within The Dark Knight. Obviously, the Joker is the primary antagonist, but The Dark Knight also discusses the concept of escalation, which was mentioned in Batman Begins. Over the course of 3 months, Goyer and Nolan were able to iron out the core plot points of what would become The Dark Knight. While Christopher Nolan was still busy with The Prestige, Jonathan Nolan had begun working on a screenplay based on the plot points provided. After 8 months of work on his own, and a further 6 months collaborating with Christopher Nolan, the brothers finally had a completed screenplay. By the end, however, the story was more of an epic crime drama than a superhero movie, and this carried over to the final product. Though the script didn't quite resemble a typical comic book adaptation, it still paid tribute to the source material. A story that had a strong influence on The Dark Knight was The Long Halloween. It not only inspired the tone and atmosphere, but there's also a couple moments that are ripped directly from that story. There is the line, "I believe in Harvey Dent," which is used as Harvey's campaign slogan in the film. There's the meeting between Batman, Gordon, and Dent where they team up to take down the mob, and even the moment when Dent has a gun pulled on him in court bears strong resemblance to the creation of Two-Face in Long Halloween. Seeing as this was a sequel, the casting process shouldn't have been too difficult, but given the roles that needed to be filled, it would prove to be complex. First off, Katie Holmes elected not to return as Rachel Dawes in The Dark Knight, instead choosing to star in Mad Money of all things. In her place, Maggie Gyllenhaal was cast, and she did a great job here. She's easily a better actress than Katie Holmes and far more convincing as Gotham's assistant district attorney. One moment I love is when she's yelling over the phone to Harvey. Throughout this entire scene, she's struggling to speak as she's lost her voice. We're never told exactly how long she's been tied to that chair, but based on this detail, we can assume that it may have been a few hours. This makes the moment even more tragic. Back to the cast though, another important role that had to be filled was that of Gotham's DA, Harvey Dent. Dent was initially meant to appear in Batman Begins in place of Rachel Dawes. It was later decided to replace him, however, as Nolan and Goyer felt that they couldn't do the character justice within Batman Begins' narrative. Clearly, they felt like they were now up to the challenge. Of the actors considered, Matt Damon and Aaron Eckhart are the only two I seriously think could have pulled it off, with Eckhart eventually being cast. Nolan says he wanted someone with an all-American charm and a heroic presence, and Eckhart embodies these traits. On top of these, however, he also portrays the necessary idealism, anger, and underlying darkness. The biggest concern with casting would come with the Joker, though. He would already be an incredibly complex character, but casting was only made more difficult due to Jack Nicholson's performance cementing a certain idea of the character into pop culture. Apparently, Heath Ledger was the only actor seriously considered for the role, but this decision was met with strong backlash. As the story goes, Ledger went on to spend a month alone in a hotel room while studying on the relevant material for the character. He truly gave his all to this performance. He went on to say that at the end of a filming day, he couldn't even move or talk. On top of that, he was only getting around 2 hours of sleep per night due to how committed he was to the role. He even insisted on doing the makeup himself, since that's how the Joker would do it. His passion for this role was clear, and it bleeds through to his performance. It is one of the single greatest performances I've ever seen, and has been properly recognized in pop culture. The Dark Knight is an incredible film in its own right, of course, but I'd be lying if I said that its current place as one of the greatest films ever made wasn't at least in part due to Ledger's performance. However, sadly, while The Dark Knight was being edited, in January of 2008, Heath Ledger passed away. I've seen claims that at least some of the praise Ledger receives for this performance was due to his passing. We've seen it with athletes like Kobe Bryant, for example, where following their deaths, their career becomes a hyperbolic, almost mythical entity, and their accomplishments are blown way out of proportion. I don't believe that this was the case with Heath Ledger whatsoever. His passing undoubtedly brought more attention to the movie prior to release. However, he genuinely gave an all-time great performance here, which we'll get more into the specifics of later on. For now, let's talk about the crew. Pretty much everyone returned from Batman Begins, including editor Lee Smith, writer David Goyer, costume designer Lindy Hemming, production designer Nathan Crowley, cinematographer Wally Pfister, and music by Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard. I complimented the editing on The Prestige, Lee Smith's previous film before The Dark Knight, and that praise carries over to this film. While The Dark Knight is a linear story chronologically, it still comes with its own challenges. Many events take place at the exact same time in different locations. These sequences are flawlessly intercut in a way that builds drama and anticipation while still being easy to follow. One that immediately comes to mind is when Commissioner Loeb, Judge Cirillo, and Harvey Dent are all targeted by the Joker. The tension slowly builds throughout this sequence, with it eventually culminating in Commissioner Loeb and Judge Cirillo's deaths, and Joker's arrival at Dent's fundraiser. With the music dying down and Joker walking about the room unchallenged, the tension hovers where it's at, allowing it to build even further into an action sequence. And speaking of action sequences, they are way better in The Dark Knight than they were in Batman Begins. Viewers can actually see what's going on, which is frankly revolutionary for the series. I previously claimed that the editing was at fault in the action sequences for Batman Begins, and that it was likely done that way intentionally in order to mask some sort of issue. And it seems that the issue may have been the suit used in that movie. It was clunky and stiff, to the point that Christian Bale couldn't even turn his head. This new suit, with its sleeker design, allowed for more dynamic action sequences, which meant that Lee Smith didn't have to cut to a different shot several times per second. Speaking of the suit, I love how an in-universe explanation was given for this new suit. Since this universe is so grounded in reality, it seems appropriate to offer an explanation for such a massive change. Rather than simply showing up in a new suit and leaving audiences to speculate, the opening action sequence is done in the Batman Begins suit, with Bruce then noticing a weakness and commissioning Lucius Fox to make him a new one. And again, this story is meant to be as realistic as possible, so this new suit isn't just a straight upgrade. He's simply trading durability for maneuverability. And while we're on the topic of Batman suits, I never really loved the Batman Begins suit. I mean, I do think it looks good. The cape coming so far forward and the wide neck made for a strong silhouette. However, those stylistic choices lack the functionality seen in every other aspect of the production design. The Dark Knight suit, on the other hand, synergizes with the established tone and sensibilities of this universe. The sleek design is far more functional and also allows for a wider range of expression when in the suit. In Batman Begins, it was hard to take conversations seriously when Batman was in costume, as Christian Bale just looked uncomfortable. The Dark Knight suit is far more reasonable in this manner, and makes moments like the interrogation scene far better than they would have been otherwise. I also usually don't shout out costume designers, mostly because I forget. But I definitely have to mention Lindy Hemming here, as she designed both of the aforementioned suits. Nathan Crowley also returned as production designer from Batman Begins. Of course, most of the heavy lifting in regard to production design was already accomplished when working on the first film, but there was still work to be done for The Dark Knight. Firstly, following the destruction of the Narrows, Gotham took on a more traditional urban aesthetic. And while I feel that the city of Gotham had more to offer in Batman Begins, the conventional urban environment of The Dark Knight fits the tone of the narrative. Also, since the story takes place only a year after the events of Batman Begins, Wayne Manor still isn't rebuilt yet. This required a new home to be made for both Bruce Wayne and Batman. For Bruce Wayne, he got a spacious penthouse that reflects just how empty that side of his life is. As Rachel says, Bruce has made her his one hope for a normal life, and has let go of anything that isn't related to his work as Batman. This is also reflected in the scene following the opening sequence, where Alfred finds Bruce in his bunker rather than his penthouse. Speaking of the bunker, I absolutely love the design here. It's industrial, functional, and modern, exactly what I'd expect from this iteration of Batman. And this excellent production design was once again captured by cinematographer Wally Pfister, and it goes without saying that he did a fantastic job once again. I love the use of the color blue throughout the story, contrasting the orange from the previous film. These cooler tones lend themselves to the narrative and create a distinct atmosphere from the other entries in this trilogy. The cinematography in The Dark Knight is also notable because it was the first major motion picture to use IMAX cameras, something that has become a staple in Nolan's career and cinema as a whole. IMAX shots only account for about 28 minutes of the film's total runtime, but they're used to great effect, especially in the opening sequence, where they're used to immediately set the tone that this story is set on a much larger scale than Batman Begins was. Aiding in creating the atmosphere of an epic is the soundtrack. The Dark Knight is a story about chaos. In this chaos is constant rising and falling tension, which is accurately captured and enhanced by the soundtrack. A particular favorite of mine is the track Why So Serious, which expands upon Heath Ledger's already dynamic performance. Christopher Nolan and Christian Bale have both said that Batman is often overshadowed by his villains. They made it a point in Batman Begins to make sure this wasn't the case. They wanted Bruce Wayne's story to be front and center. With the character having an entire film to be firmly established, however, now is the time for someone else to steal the show, and that's exactly what Heath Ledger's Joker did. His performance is chaotic and dynamic. You never know what he's going to do or say next. He's sociopathic and maniacal, and yet he still occasionally says things the audience can't help but laugh at. Heath Ledger had originally met with Nolan during pre-production of Batman Begins for the role of Batman. Ledger felt the part wasn't right for him though. When it came time to find the right Joker, however, Ledger actually sought the part out, and before the script was even completed, Ledger had gotten the part. Joker in The Dark Knight is more of a primal force of nature than a character. He has no origin, no name, he doesn't even have a match on his fingerprints. There is no attempt to humanize him whatsoever. He doesn't have a goal or motivation. In what's essentially his character introduction, his conversation with the mob, it seems that he wants money and he wants to kill Batman. As we see later on though, he clearly doesn't care for money and he doesn't want to kill Batman. There is no consistency to him at all. He claims to be a man of his word in one scene, and then goes on to lie when telling Batman the addresses of where Harvey and Rachel are. He has no rules. It's as he says, he's simply an agent of chaos, and this makes for a terrifying villain and foil to Batman. Batman wants nothing more than to establish order and justice in Gotham, to give the people something to believe in and aspire to. And this is where the concept of escalation comes in. Joker says it himself.
This town deserves a better class of criminal, and I'm gonna give it to him.
It's only natural that when an unfailing good rises, or an immovable object if you will, an unstoppable force must rise up to combat it. The previous criminals weren't cutting it, so a primal force was sent to balance the scales. Joker pushes Batman to his absolute limit and consistently makes him question these rules he lives by. The Dark Knight is largely built by sequences and set pieces that push our protagonist further and further. The narrative structure actually reflects The Long Halloween pretty well. With our protagonist focused on a different goal, a serial killer is unleashed who ends up massively upsetting the established order. Each issue, or sequence in the film's case, focuses on a different murder that tests the protagonist in a new way. And each is worthy of serving as the climax in any other story, with the grandiose set pieces and philosophical implications. Initially, while the Joker slowly garners a reputation, he's ignored by both the protagonist and antagonist. They're wrapped up in their own conflict until Chaos Incarnate comes along to shake things up. The first sequence is the murder of Commissioner Loeb and Judge Cirillo. I previously praised the music and editing in this sequence, and those are definitely highlights, but really everything about this is perfect. It marks the first time the Joker and Batman meet face to face, the action sequence is solid, and the murder calls into question how trustworthy the men in Gordon's unit are. And these murders, alongside the assassination attempt on the mayor, prove Joker's point that he makes to Harvey later in the film. While yes, the Joker's thinking is flawed, there is an element of truth in terms of the societal imbalance as to the value of a human life. If a truckload of soldiers dies, no one bats an eye, but a threat is made to the mayor and the whole city is on high alert. The difference, of course, is the rank or status and the plan that we have for these people. As a society, we expect soldiers to die, so it comes as no surprise. But a human life is a human life. That's the attraction of chaos. It's unruly and seemingly fair. It ignores status and rank and impartially destroys everything in its path. With all that established, we can now discuss the best stretch of the narrative and some of the best scenes ever put to film. The interrogation scene is incredible, and it's between two of the best sequences in the story. The first being Harvey Dent's arrest, and the second being Rachel's murder. Individually, each would be the best moment in any other superhero movie, but they're back to back here. From the 1 hour 13 minute mark to the 1 hour 40 minute mark, The Dark Knight is the definition of peak fiction. The sequence leading to the Joker's capture is frantic and has some of the best action in the film, especially when seen in IMAX. Also, I just have to throw in how cool the Batpod is. Yet another excellent design by Nathan Crowley. Anyway, after the twist that Gordon is still alive following the assassination attempt on the mayor, which is an impressive bit of storytelling in its own right, we finally get a triumph on behalf of our heroes. Since they set out to work together on that rooftop early in the story, they haven't won much. But finally, they seem closer to their goal. And it took the efforts of all three men. And this is why the interrogation scene hits as hard as it needed to. As always, it's revealed that the Joker was one step ahead, and that Harvey Dent never made it home. When a film reaches classic status like The Dark Knight has, moments that rely on shock value lose weight as time goes on, and this is one of those moments. I cannot overstate how cool this was to me as a kid. Suddenly Batman just appears behind Joker and slams his head into a table. It's completely unexpected and an incredible way to start a scene. And this is the moment where Batman and the Joker's differing philosophies finally go head to head. Joker exists in a world without rules, which allows him to consistently be one step ahead. His entire goal in this narrative is just to combat the Batman in any way possible, and since getting him to unmask by threatening him with the lives of civilians didn't work, he instead attacks his ideals or rules. He puts Batman in an impossible scenario by essentially forcing him to kill. Consciously making the choice not to save someone is effectively murder, so he forces Batman to make a choice as to who he will save. Also, this philosophy kinda calls into question the ending to Batman Begins, since he just let Ra's al Ghul die, which by this metric was murder. And I just noticed this detail on my most recent viewing. It was probably incredibly obvious to everyone else, but Batman slamming the Joker's head into the glass is actually what allowed Joker to escape, since it sent shards of glass everywhere, and Joker used one of these shards of glass to hold the police officer hostage. It just further goes to show how every move our protagonists make seems to just play into the Joker's hands. This whole sequence is extremely tense. The interrogation quickly turns into a frantic race against the clock in order to save both Harvey and Rachel. Seeing as this is a superhero story though, and since we're only halfway through this narrative, obviously Batman will find a way to save both Harvey Dent and Rachel. Though the situation may seem impossible, it is in the nature of superheroes to accomplish the impossible.
Harvey, it's okay. It's all right. Listen.
A major plot element of The Dark Knight is the dichotomy between Harvey Dent and the Batman. They are mostly similar, to the point that many in Gotham believe them to be one and the same. However, they differ in how far they're willing to go. Batman refuses to break his rules for anything. However, Harvey Dent's idealized sense of justice shatters when put under test. Rachel's death was obviously unexpected in-universe, but even as an audience, it seemingly comes out of nowhere. In hindsight, her heartfelt goodbye to Alfred seems to suggest such a fate, but it still wasn't obvious. She is meant to be the typical damsel in distress who is rescued just in the nick of time. And in terms of drama, she still had much more to offer this story. Her choice between Bruce and Harvey still held weight for the audience, and could have been worked in a myriad of ways. But just as in reality, however, death doesn't wait for all the plot lines to neatly be tied up. And this adds to the tragedy of her death. It's unfair, which is exactly why the impartiality of chaos attracts Harvey. Since chaos isn't targeted, it is fair. So on his revenge tour, Harvey decides to leave everything to chance. Harvey was targeted because of his idealism and goodness. He was the best of our protagonists morally. He was the lawful good of the group in a sense. While Gordon relied on cops he knew were crooked, and Batman doesn't hesitate to resort to torture, Dent up to this point had done everything by the book. But as we saw when he tortured one of Joker's henchmen, he had a darkness inside of him that motivated him to do whatever it takes for the sake of justice. The Joker targeted this darkness and aimed to plunge Gotham into absolute anarchy by inverting the moral core of the city. And I think the sequence with Coleman Reese establishes just how necessary Dent is to Gotham. Reese claims to know the Batman's true identity. That information being revealed would ruin Joker's game though, so he sets up a challenge. If Coleman Reese isn't dead within the next hour, Joker will blow up a hospital. Obviously, this is a threat that affects a lot of people. Not only those in a hospital, but also those with family in the hospital. By not specifying the hospital either, chaos only spreads. It's just as Joker promised during the interrogation scene.
I'll show you. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other.
They all quickly turn on Coleman Reese. The whole city is suddenly after one man. This sequence serves as an example of what Gotham would be like without Dent's guiding influence. With Dent out of commission, the people immediately begin to pursue their own ideas of justice, with Coleman Reese specifically stating that revealing the Batman's identity is what Harvey would want, despite him refusing to do that very thing earlier. This establishes just how badly Gotham needs Harvey Dent, or at least the idea of him. And while this sequence seems to prove that Gotham may be beyond saving, as we later see, this isn't the case. The third act of The Dark Knight is full of the expected grand action sequence and exciting stunts, but at its core is a moral dilemma so provocative that it will likely stay with viewers long after the film's conclusion. The ferry problem is simple at its core. One ferry is full of innocent civilians, while the other is full of prisoners. If either ferry elects to blow up the other, they get to live. If neither can decide, however, they both die. It can be troubling to consider what we each as individuals would do in such a situation. While we can believe that we'd react in an honorable way, there really is no way to know for sure. In this moment, Gotham proved that it wasn't beyond saving though. There were good people left in the city. There are even good people found amongst the city's prisons. Clearly there is hope for the Batman's mission. One aspect of this sequence that I think flies under the radar though is Batman's unflinching confidence in the people of Gotham. He never once doubts that neither ferry will elect to destroy the other. Instead, he focuses on the task at hand and leaves the city's fate in its own hands. Despite this optimism, Joker's plan aims to turn the entire city in on itself. Batman is a relatively static character throughout The Dark Knight. We were familiarized with the many facets of Bruce Wayne all throughout Batman Begins, so spending time rehashing that material would have been a waste. Despite this, he still has an arc throughout this story. When initially tested by Joker, he can't endure. As Carmine Falcone said in Batman Begins, Bruce will always fear what he doesn't understand. And as Alfred says, Bruce does not understand the Joker. He thought he had conquered all of his fears as he came to know everything he would have to defeat. But when presented with something unknowable, that insecurity returns. Insecurity in his tactics, his mission, and his righteousness. He's pushed to the point of turning himself in when he simply can't endure any longer. Alfred tries to help him realize this is exactly what the Batman is for. But Bruce doesn't understand in this moment. The Batman isn't a hero. He's an incorruptible symbol. He has no limits and can become whatever Gotham requires, even if it means being hated by the very city he's sworn to protect. This lesson is finally learned by Bruce in the closing moments of the narrative. The Batman shoulders an incredible burden, one that no man can carry. He absolves Harvey Dent of his crimes by taking on the guilt, saving Gotham's soul in the process, and finally paving the way for peace in the city. This ending sequence never fails to give me chills. Gordon's monologue is delivered astoundingly well and is triumphant yet melancholy, as if weighing the cost of these events all throughout his speech, and it leads to the single greatest roll credits moment in film history in my eyes. While Bruce has technically accomplished his goal by the end of the story, that of saving his city and finally hanging up the cape, the toll that it took on our protagonist is evident. He is also left weighing the cost. While the war was won, he paid an intense price. The only hope Bruce had for a normal life seemingly died with Rachel, and with Batman being no more, he has nothing left. And as with anything built on a lie, the peace in Gotham is fragile. This ending is far more tragic than I think people give it credit for. The Dark Knight is one of those tragedies like Whiplash or Star Wars Episode 3 where I can't help but wish for a different ending upon each rewatch, hoping the characters don't make those seemingly inconsequential decisions that lead to the absolute tragedy. This dread aids each rewatch, alongside the ever-entertaining performances, dialogue, and action sequences. The Dark Knight is up there as one of my most rewatched films. It's just perfect. It's also one of the most quotable movies I've ever seen. I mean, just the other day I watched this movie with some friends and we would just quote every one of Joker's lines. I think a big reason why The Dark Knight holds such a special place in my heart is because of how popular it is. My whole life I've had nerdier interests, video games, anime, comic books. The Dark Knight was one of the only things that I really enjoyed that I could share with everyone. The near universal praise it received gave me a go-to option when discussing my interests with people. While Batman Begins started the revolution, The Dark Knight kicked the door open. For the first time, superheroes weren't just mainstream, they were actually kinda cool. To have a film of this high quality, with this many eyes on it, in this genre, seems like an impossibility, but Christopher Nolan made it happen. At every turn during the production of The Dark Knight, Nolan sought the opportunity to be revolutionary, even down to his insistence on using IMAX cameras. Will a superhero movie that's better than The Dark Knight ever be made? Maybe. It's unlikely, but that possibility can't be ruled out. However, I don't think the superhero genre will ever receive a title as revolutionary as The Dark Knight again. The level of quality, the talent, and the passion behind it will never be matched. That's why I can confidently say that there will never be another film like The Dark Knight. That's not to say that people haven't tried though. In fact, Nolan himself tried only 4 years later with The Dark Knight's sequel, The Dark Knight Rises. In my video on The Dark Knight, I mentioned how a sequel can be a scary thing to attempt, and that effect is only compounded when making a trilogy. Even more so when your next entry is meant to be the definitive end to one of the most lucrative franchises in cinematic history. There are trilogies where the first entry is the best, there are others where the second is the best, and there are even some where the third is superior to its predecessors. Making a complete trilogy, where all three films are near equal in terms of quality, however, is a near impossible task. Yet that's exactly what Christopher Nolan was attempting with The Dark Knight Rises. As a kid, I watched Batman Begins and The Dark Knight countless times before finally getting to Dark Knight Rises. I had become a huge fan of the character by that point, and was extremely excited for it. However, after my first viewing, I never watched it again. Why is that? That's what we're going to find out today. Rises served as the official send-off for Christopher Nolan's time with the character of Batman. He had proven with Inception that he was a brand at this point. His name alone could draw an audience to a theater, and he was now free to tell whatever stories he liked. Despite that, he still chose to return to Gotham one last time. Clearly, he must have had some true inspiration and a clear vision in mind for the final installment in his Batman trilogy. The Dark Knight was a massive success by all metrics, so following that up may have seemed unfeasible. However, Christopher Nolan was yet to make even a mediocre movie by this point, so fans had hope. The Dark Knight Rises was one of the most widely anticipated films of the 2010s, and in July 2012, it finally released. It outperformed The Dark Knight at the box office, and initially received similar praise from critics. 13 years later, however, it's often regarded as the weakest of the trilogy. In fact, that's exactly how I felt after my first viewing years ago. Why was this the case, and has my opinion changed at all since then? Let's find out. Today we'll be taking a look at the finale to the legendary Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, The Dark Knight Rises. After the success of The Dark Knight, the seemingly inevitable sequel was on everyone's mind, especially considering how that narrative ended. There seems to have been a near infinite number of ways you could take this story. You could start right where we left off with Batman still being pursued, or perhaps you could show the immediate aftermath, with Bruce reminiscing about the events of that story. While the possibilities may have seemed endless, Christopher Nolan wasn't initially sure about making a third film. He agreed to work on it only if he and writer David Goyer could come up with a story that interested him. By the end of 2008, Nolan did complete a rough story outline. However, he then went off to work on Inception. In early 2010 though, Nolan and Goyer reportedly cracked the story. Soon after this, Goyer would leave the project to work on Man of Steel. Fortunately, Goyer and Nolan already had the story mostly ironed out by that point, and Jonathan Nolan soon began working on a screenplay. Taking inspiration from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, The Dark Knight Rises would be an epic, focusing on the class divide in Gotham. The first two movies threatened to turn Gotham in on itself, and with this third entry, Nolan would finally go through with that promise. Nolan had finally found a story that interested him, and the long-awaited sequel to The Dark Knight was officially underway. Thus far, the pre-production cycle mirrored The Dark Knight pretty well. so all signs seem to point to yet another masterpiece from the Nolan brothers. Much of the same crew also returned for The Dark Knight Rises, including production designer Nathan Crowley, cinematographer Wally Pfister, and the score was once again composed by Hans Zimmer. Nolan tackled each film in his Batman trilogy as though they were unique stories rather than just sequels. This is most evident from a visual standpoint. Nathan Crowley had 3 major tasks when working on The Dark Knight Rises. First was the Batcave. After being teased in Batman Begins, people were obviously going to have high expectations for the iconic Batcave, and this rendition definitely delivers. The Nolan Batman movies have a habit of making alterations from their source material. However, this is a fairly traditional Batcave. The second challenge Crowley had was designing the Batcopter. This was by far the most fantastical element he had to design thus far, and he somehow had to make it fit in Nolan's grounded universe. Fortunately, The Dark Knight Rises concerns itself much less than its predecessors on remaining grounded, so this task wasn't quite as challenging as it would have been in either of the previous entries. Despite this fact, Crowley held true to the conventions of this series and approached the design from the same militaristic angle as the Tumbler or Batpod. What's also impressive is the way this design was utilized while filming. A full-scale model was actually built and mounted on a vehicle to simulate flight, with CGI only being used afterwards to remove the rigs and add details like propellers. It's frankly incredible and is yet another impressive feat in practical effects by Christopher Nolan. The third challenge Nathan Crowley had to tackle for The Dark Knight Rises was the city of Gotham itself. Gotham retained the traditional urban aesthetic from The Dark Knight. However, this time, much of the narrative takes place during the winter, with Gotham being covered in snow. While this may seem like a small change, it creates a completely distinct atmosphere from The Dark Knight. For many of the establishing shots of the city used throughout the film, different city skylines were used to create Gotham. This made the city feel bigger, which fits the larger scale of the story. Aiding in creating this effect is the use of IMAX. The first 6 minutes were shot entirely using IMAX cameras, and combined with the insanely impressive practical effects, create an unforgettable opening. It's genuinely stunning. I obviously haven't seen every movie to use IMAX cameras, but I believe that The Dark Knight Rises had the single most impressive use of IMAX up to this point. The cinematography in The Dark Knight Rises would already be notable because of just how gorgeous it is, but it also set a record with 72 minutes worth of IMAX footage, the most of any feature film up to that point. Comparatively, The Dark Knight only had about 28 minutes worth of IMAX footage, and I can't overstate how significant this is. A big draw of The Dark Knight Rises is the scale. It aims to consistently wow the audience with pure spectacle, and in large part due to these IMAX shots, it succeeds. And as always, backing up the visuals and consistently enhancing each scene is the incredible score by Hans Zimmer. While his work on Inception is still my favorite up to this point, The Dark Knight Rises is the best score in the Batman trilogy in my eyes. It brings back many of the iconic themes from the first two, with 2 notable additions. Firstly, Bane's theme, which incorporates the chant later in the story, which we'll get into later. And secondly, Catwoman's theme. It fits her character really well, and I love the way it comes in as Selina Kyle drops her facade in her opening scene. Speaking of Selina Kyle, we have to talk about the casting choices in The Dark Knight Rises. All of the mainstays in this series return. Obviously Christian Bale as Bruce Wayne, Gary Oldman as Jim Gordon, Morgan Freeman as Lucius Fox, and Michael Caine as Alfred Pennyworth. Although Alfred does have a slightly more limited role in Rises than he had in the previous entries, his best scene in the trilogy can be found here, that of course being the conversation in the stairwell. The way Michael Caine's voice is breaking all throughout the scene is heartbreaking. Also, that line about hearing Bruce cry as a baby really establishes to the audience just how close these characters are and how deeply Alfred cares for Bruce. And all of this obviously adds just that much more weight to the ending. Moving on to the new additions to the cast though, we have Selina Kyle played by Anne Hathaway. Anne Hathaway does a good job in the part, but unfortunately, Catwoman feels just a bit limited in this story. A lot of her character development takes place during montages, and I just don't really buy her romance with Bruce in the end. Admittedly, that is more of a script issue than an acting issue. I do love her design though. The goggles in particular are such an inspired idea. The idea that when she puts them on her head they look like cat ears was truly a stroke of genius. Another newcomer is Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character, John Blake, who was later revealed to be this universe's Robin. Kind of. We'll get more into his character arc later, but I think he might be the single most misunderstood person in this story. The next major addition to the cast was Marion Cotillard, who plays Miranda Tate, or Talia al Ghul. And to be honest, this whole character is just a complete failure. From a writing standpoint, it's already a flawed concept. However, even the performance isn't very good. She's meant to be the twist villain of the story, but Marion Cotillard just plays her too evil from the beginning. From her very first appearance, it's clear that this character is a villain. Not even her first appearance, actually. Fans had guessed who Marion Cotillard was playing before the film even released. Within the story though, the biggest problem with the character is her dialogue, with her having such subtle lines as,
"You have to invest if you want to restore balance to the world."
That's a classic villain line right there, but the performance isn't very convincing either. And all of this not to mention her death scene, which has already been discussed at length by many others. It's genuinely horrible, and one of the most embarrassing moments in Nolan's entire filmography. Yes, the performance is bad, but the fault mostly falls on the editor for using that take. Of course, there is the possibility that this was the best take they got, and if that was the case, maybe just cut the whole thing out and leave her death ambiguous? I don't know, anything is better than this.
Oh, you think darkness is your ally? You merely adopted the dark.
After the passing of Heath Ledger, it was decided that the Joker wouldn't return in any capacity. Warner Bros. Was okay with this decision, however they wanted the villain to at least be someone in a similar vein to Joker, with the Riddler being their top choice. Nolan wanted to go in a different direction though. In the prior two movies, Batman was never truly matched physically. Once the villains finally came face to face with the Caped Crusader, they were usually defeated soon after. Nolan wanted his next villain to be physically imposing, to contrast everyone who had come before him, and to push Batman to his absolute limit. These concepts are exactly what led to Bane's creation in 1993, so clearly he was the ideal candidate for this story, with Tom Hardy eventually being cast as Bane. Now aside from the race swapping, I think this actually was a pretty good casting. Tom Hardy's a phenomenal actor and brought the necessary menace to the role. Obviously he had to go through quite the physical transformation, and his performance was also made especially difficult by the mask he was required to wear. It's very different from Bane's design in the comics, but I think it fits this iteration of the character well, although I am partial to it because it bears strong resemblance to Darth Vader. Either way, due to the mask, Tom Hardy could only express emotion with his eyes, and each of his lines had to be dubbed over in post. Notably, because of this and some bad sound mixing, Bane doesn't exactly sound present within the film. His voice sounds separate from the rest of the characters. Now don't get me wrong, this is a bad thing. It undoubtedly breaks the audience's immersion. However, in my opinion, it also makes Bane far more threatening. I found myself listening very closely when he spoke because of just how jarring he was. And while we're on the topic of Bane's voice, we have to discuss the vocal performance itself. This is one of the most common talking points in The Dark Knight Rises, and is one of the most hated elements of the entire trilogy. And on my first viewing, I wholeheartedly agreed with the criticism. After rewatching the movie multiple times for this video though, I'd be lying if I said the voice didn't grow on me. I honestly kinda love it now. There are some goofy line deliveries for sure.
Crashing displayed.
But for every weird line like that, there's one like this.
I didn't see the light until I was already a man. By then it was nothing to me but blinding.
I love the way he roars the word blinding. It perfectly caps off one of the best villain monologues I've ever heard. And what he accomplishes here only adds to his menace. Before we get to that though, let's set the scene for Batman and Bane's fight in the sewers. At the start of our story, Bruce is a shell of his former self. After losing Rachel, in his eyes, he lost the one chance he had for a normal life. And after effectively losing the mantle of Batman as well, Bruce is left with nothing to live for. Once both Blake and Gordon tell Bruce that the world needs Batman again, Bruce finally decides to put the cape and cowl on once again. Before he does though, he has a heartfelt conversation with Alfred, where it's made obvious that Bruce isn't ready. Alfred tries repeatedly to warn him against rushing in blindly. However, in a moment that bears much resemblance to The Dark Knight, Bruce completely underestimates his enemy, and disaster follows. This fight in the sewer is spectacular. The way the scene shifts into IMAX as the trap is sprung immediately works to increase the tension. The lack of music emphasizes the importance of this moment, and the fight choreography is the best the series had seen up to this point. On top of that, this scene contains the aforementioned monologue, and the moment where Bane breaks Batman's back is forever etched in my brain. Now, a villain sparing the hero's life is usually a tired trope, but I think it actually works here. Up to this point, Bruce has welcomed death, and Bane, recognizing this, instead decides to torture Bruce by bringing him to the pit, a prison Bane was once captive in. This scene also gives us an explanation on why Bane doesn't immediately destroy Gotham.
I learned here that there can be no true despair without hope.
He wants to give the citizens a false hope before their seemingly inevitable despair. It's the same reason why the courts later in the story offer the choice of exile. It gives the convicted one last glimmer of hope before they're ultimately plunged into despair. Of course, this is the same reason why Bane imprisoned Bruce in the pit, but it also serves to create one more parallel between the characters. For all intents and purposes, Bane and Batman are two sides of the same coin, both excellent fighters and brilliant minds trained by the League of Shadows. Another notable similarity between the two is their masks. They obviously both wear masks, but each one is also defeated as their mask is destroyed. A major difference between the two exists, however, in their reactions to the pit.
Bruce, why do we fall?
Bane never escaped from the pit. Eventually, after allowing Talia to escape, she came back for him along with Ra's al Ghul. Bruce, on the other hand, is determined to rise from the pit, and I love this entire sequence. It feels like a short film within the film, and is the strongest bit of the narrative by far. The callbacks to Bruce falling down the well in Batman Begins add a layer of nuance that isn't common in the superhero genre. The idea that Bruce has been essentially trapped in a pit since his parents' death is powerful. In Batman Begins, he supposedly conquered his fears. However, that wasn't the end of his journey with the concept. In The Dark Knight, he gained a new fear, a fear of the unknowable. And in Rises, he must learn to fear death once again, or in other words, gain the will to live. There's an excellent line where an inmate tells Bruce that fear will find him if he climbs without the rope. Right on cue, a swarm of bats rush past him as he attempts to make the climb. These bats, representing his original fear, found him to give him the determination needed to finally rise from the pit. This pit symbolizing not only him rising above everything he faced in this narrative, but also finally moving past all the repressed emotions from his parents' death. It's this sequence that makes the ending feel earned, and in my eyes, it's the greatest scene in the entire trilogy. The way the music swells, the callbacks, the powerful chant, and the pure catharsis present in this scene is unmatched. It truly feels like the culmination of 2.5 films and properly prepares the audience for the intense and monumental final act. The visuals are incredible, the set pieces are noteworthy, and the final fight versus Bane is immensely gratifying as an audience. So far, The Dark Knight Rises may seem like a masterpiece. Sure, I brought out small issues here and there, but for the most part, it seems like a sound narrative. However, that isn't the case, unfortunately. The Dark Knight Rises isn't a fundamentally flawed story. A simple plot synopsis may make it sound like an inevitable classic, and the visuals would seem to support this claim. However, Rises ends up being a case of death by 1,000 cuts. There isn't one big issue that tears the structure down, but rather many small cracks that eventually topple the entire thing. Of course, there is the aforementioned issues like Catwoman's lackluster portrayal, Bane's odd sound mixing, and his inconsistent voice in general. However, the largest of these issues is Talia al Ghul. I briefly touched on it earlier, but seriously, this was such a misstep narratively. I'm not a fan of twist villains in the first place, but when the villain is barely hidden to begin with, and also isn't given any real depth, it's made even worse. It also doesn't help that Bane was actually a very interesting character up to this point, and he's unceremoniously dispatched in less than a second. I seriously think that Bane's death is the worst moment in the entire Dark Knight trilogy. While Talia al Ghul's death is executed poorly, Bane's is such a massive missed opportunity. This is the man who broke Batman. He forced Bruce to finally reconcile with his past and conquer and accept the fear within him. We did get the incredible final bout between the two, but we were robbed of the true resolution that this story seemed to be building up to. All in all, the Talia reveal ends up feeling unearned, uninteresting, and underwhelming. There's also the issue of Jim Gordon. Admittedly, this is a smaller problem, but I would have liked to see some real resolution for his character. We don't even know for sure where he's at career-wise by the end of the story. When Bane read his letter aloud to the people of Gotham, I figured this meant his actual resignation, but then we see him during the epilogue on the roof of the MCU like nothing ever happened. I would have loved at least one extra scene to give him a proper send-off, because he ended up being one of my favorite characters in the entire trilogy. There's also the issue of the perceived plot holes. To be completely honest, these don't hamper my enjoyment of the movie personally, but I understand how they can be a big deal to some people. There are some logistical issues presented by Bane's occupation of Gotham. There's the issue of Bruce somehow getting back to Gotham in only 23 days. There's also the issue of how exactly he got into Gotham. I know these plot holes really do ruin the movie for some people, but like I said, for me they don't really matter. They can each be explained pretty easily, but it probably would have been better for the film itself to at least attempt an explanation. One complaint this movie gets a lot, however, that I don't agree with, is all the hate aimed at Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character, John Blake. Personally, I absolutely love the character, and I found his arc to be one of the most well-developed in the narrative. While I do think that some of the time devoted to him should have been given to Catwoman, what we ended up getting out of his character was well worthwhile to me. His arc shows his growing disillusionment with the police force, with him finally deciding to become a vigilante like Batman, perhaps even becoming this universe's version of Nightwing. This transition is symbolized by a physical change. He first loses the cop uniform when he's promoted to detective. He throws away his gun after accidentally killing someone with it. He loses his police car after Bane's attack on the city. And finally, he throws away his badge after being condemned to die by the military. Overall, I was a big fan of his character, and I disagree with the common notion that he was a waste of time or out of place in this story. If I had to define The Dark Knight Rises in one word, it would be ambitious. It has a ton of good ideas, but unfortunately not all of them stick. After watching Rises when I was a kid, I did not like it at all. Before my first viewing for this video, I decided to write down my thoughts on the film, and I claimed I found it overstuffed, vain, and self-indulgent. After that viewing, there were only small changes in my opinion. I appreciated the movie a lot more from a technical standpoint. The visuals were frankly revolutionary, the practical effects incredible, and the score was one of the best I'd ever heard. Upon second and third viewing for this video though, I gained an appreciation for the narrative. The themes hit home in a way that they never had before. The characters had a depth that I didn't bother to understand previously, and the big action sequences were no longer just typical bombastic superhero moments, but immensely powerful, emotionally resonant set pieces. No, this movie is not a masterpiece, but in the making of this video, I learned to love The Dark Knight Rises. I respect it as the conclusion to the Nolan Batman films, and believe that it also can stand on its own as a landmark title in the superhero genre. I've come to describe it this way. The Dark Knight Rises feels like the second to the last draft of a masterpiece. Nolan was so close to recapturing the magic of The Dark Knight, which should have been impossible, but he just barely missed the mark. The small missteps added up until eventually Rises fell to a level just short of its predecessors. Rises is the worst of the Nolan Batman trilogy, but that doesn't make it a bad movie. I have a newfound appreciation for it, and it's likely a title I'll return to a number of times from now on, which is not something I would have ever said previously. With that, Nolan's time with the Caped Crusader came to a close. He would go on to help kick off the DCEU, DC's initial answer to the MCU, Marvel's cinematic juggernaut. We all know how that ended, but of course, that isn't all he did in the coming years. His godfathering of the upcoming Man of Steel would prove to be nothing more than a footnote in his career compared to what was to come. Just 2 years after The Dark Knight Rises, Nolan would direct yet another original story, entitled Interstellar, one of the most widely discussed films of the 2010s, and yet another Nolan project that ranks highly on many people's all-time rankings. That's the next Nolan film I'll be covering, but there's a few other movies I'd like to talk about beforehand. If that sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.